Hey guys, so I promised you guys I'd be uploading something dealing with Abdel Nasser. As you guys may recall, Jamal Abdel Nasser is one of the authoritarian leaders that we talked about as part of one of our IB topics, which is authoritarian and single party states. So, what I'm going to be doing with you guys tonight is mainly focusing on three key aspects: Abdel Nasser's rise to power, his consolidation of power, and the domestic policies. We're not going to focus as much on the foreign. So, right off the bat, who was Abdel Nasser? So, Abdel Nasser was born just outside Alexandria. He came from an okay background, kind of sort of upper middle class. And the idea was he was the son of a clerk. So he did better. He wasn't like a farmer. So upper middle class might not be the best way to put it. So let's call it middle class. He actually benefited from a law that had been recently passed that allowed people of all social classes to join the army. So he was portrayed as a man of the people a lot of the time, and he played this up as much as possible. His image really helped. A lot of people speculate that because Abdel Nasser himself was darker skinned, he didn't really resemble the sort of more westernized image. He had a kind of strong Arab figure, and this may be a superficial thing to point out, but it definitely didn't hurt. So in any case, let's focus on Egypt's situation. Now, Egypt's main obstacle, much like Cuba, was the British occupation. Now, despite the fact that England had signed a number of agreements with the Egyptians to sort of back off and give them more autonomy, the reality was that each one of these agreements didn't really amount to much. On paper, Egypt was given a greater amount of autonomy. In reality, however, there was very little that Egypt itself had control of. So at the top, you had the king. The king, when Abdel Nasser took over, was King Farouk. And of course, you had the Wafd government. And the army was a little bit overlooked. And this is what kind of helped Abdel Nasser and his colleagues plan their little revolution. So the idea was, of course, that Abdel Nasser had the idea, with a number of other officers, to sort of start planning and testing the waters to see what they could get done. Now, the idea was that Egypt wasn't immune from the political nationalism, liberalism movements that had taken place throughout the Arab world. At this time, it was a very, I would say, charged time in Arab political history. So they had a number of protests, and after the 1948 war, these got to a fever pitch. There was a lot of anti-British sentiment. So there was already a lot of popular dissent towards the British. There was also a lot of distrust of the government, the Wafd government, as well as the king. So Abdel Nasser really took over in Egypt, which already had a deep resentment for the people in charge. There was very little popular support. The British had repeatedly promised that they would back off, but time and time again, they were showing that they were going to stay with the Suez Canal, which was a very important transit hub for them. And of course, they were going to try as much as possible to remain present and to have their own special set of privileges. So this didn't really suit Abdel Nasser. Now, the fact of the matter is, there were lots of groups that were active in fomenting dissent, and so it's important to understand that Abdel Nasser's effort comes on the back of three major groups. You had the parliamentary reformers, the leftists, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Of the three, I would argue the most powerful would be the Muslim Brotherhood. So these three groups each had their own base activism. Egyptians as citizens had been fairly active for quite some time. They even had a feminist movement dating back to the 1920s. So the Egyptian people were no strangers to political activism. They were very fond of having free press. They were very fond of being expressive. They were very fond of being politically active. So once again, Abdel Nasser was seen as an important alternative for them. So the thing is, however, one of Abdel Nasser's most clever measures was not to put his foot forward at the beginning. This is the same thing that happened with Castro. See, the thing is, to convince people you're not a dictator, a lot of dictators favor the strategy of just pretending to not want to be in charge. And you're like, no, I'm not going to be in charge. So in the case of Abdel Nasser, the patsy, the guy that was in charge on paper, was General, I keep forgetting if it's Ahmed or Mohammed Dagib. I want to say Mohammed Dagib, but I'm pretty sure it could be Ahmed. Let me just double check here. It's going to drive me crazy. So Muhammad Naguib, sorry. So Muhammad Naguib was, I guess you could say, a traditional candidate for power because he kind of showed up as a military strongman. He was a hero in the 1948 war. He was a favorable candidate. So Abdel Nasser kind of put it in a position where he wasn't the one interested in power. Muhammad Naguib was going to be the one who was more active. So after the coup d'etat, which was mostly bloodless in 1952, what happened was Abdel Nasser still went nowhere near power. He made sure that he wasn't actually near it. So they kind of made it a progressive, I guess you could say, slide into dictatorship. So the idea was, of course, that they needed to make it appear like they were doing things by the book. So Ali Maher was brought up as the prime minister. The king was kindly, legally, asked to abdicate, leave, and that of course meant that the new government would begin being formed. However, over time, the free officers started consolidating their power. So the coup, as an actual event, is widely regarded as a bloodless coup, which is really a sign that the government had very little popular support. The Wafd government had very little popular support. The king, who took over when he was 16, and in the eyes of the Egyptians lost them the 1948 war, was not very popular either. So obviously, Muhammad Naguib was seen as a strong, capable leader. People gravitated towards him. And Abdel Nasser was kind of in the sidelines. So Abdel Nasser himself really managed to stay out of the public eye. So as I mentioned before, Abdel Nasser and the free officers had three main rivals. Now, the tricky part was that they needed to stay with these rivals of theirs until they could slowly and subtly shunt them out of power. And as I mentioned before, the three rivals were the parliamentary reformers, the leftists, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Each rival, in turn, would be dealt with through a series of arrests, strikes that would be put down violently, and various accusations. This became a very common thing. You know, like in any dictatorship, you get accused of being an enemy of the state, you become accused of fomenting dissent, and so the leftists found themselves on the chopping block before pretty much anybody. They had a number of protests that broke out after the coup, and they figured they were going to move more towards a socialist state. But of course, Abdel Nasser wanted to make sure that these leftist leaders didn't get anywhere near power. He wanted his own people. And Abdel Nasser was very particular about this. He was really big into nepotism. So he didn't like putting in people that he didn't know or he didn't trust. And this applied more so for leftists because he didn't trust them even more, I would say. So besides that, the parliamentary reformers would end up being rounded up and arrested in many cases, and later newspapers, universities, etc. would all be victims of censorship and control. It was very important to note that he was very, I would say, gradual in his transition to an authoritarian state. But of course, in the end, Muhammad Naguib started to fear Abdel Nasser, but Abdel Nasser was, I would argue, too quick for him. He maneuvered and he basically accused Naguib and his supporters of sedition. Ends up having Naguib pushed out of the picture, and he becomes the head honcho. So, of course, the final straw is the Muslim Brotherhood, and some of you guys actually in class argued that it was possibly a conspiracy, like a false flag operation, that he got the assassin to do it, and then made it look like it was an assassination attempt, when in reality it was a put-on. I don't know so much about that. There's not really any historical evidence to suggest that, but like the Reichstag fire with Hitler, he may not have set it up, but he definitely benefited from it. So, as you guys may know, a Muslim Brotherhood assassin with possibly the worst aim ever fired, I want to say 8 shots at Abdel Nasser, and all of them miss. Funnily enough, my grandma insisted it's because he was wearing a bulletproof vest, but no, as far as I recall, he didn't actually hit any of them. And he wasn't even standing that far. It was like 20, 30 meters. But yeah, clearly the guy didn't really have the benefit of aim. And of course, as a result, Muslim Brotherhood leaders rounded up en masse, thrown in jail. So with most of his political rivals in jail, Abdel Nasser now set about making himself more central. Draws up a new constitution, creates a new vision for the Egyptian state. So Nasser's platform is by and large nationalist and socialist. and much more emphasized on nationalists. So over time, Nasser starts nationalizing a lot of political institutions and private institutions, making sure, well, nationalizing political institutions is redundant, nationalizing a lot of private institutions and industries, and taking a larger role in the economy. And of course, he switches Egypt over and starts moving more towards a socialist model. Now, Egypt vacillated slightly. Initially, Egypt wanted to be more pro-Western, but when it seemed clear that the West wasn't really interested in working with the Egyptians, they ended up making an arms deal with Czechoslovakia, and this would set them down the path of working with the Soviets. They had a somewhat rocky relationship with the Soviets. I would argue in many cases that the Soviets saw it as valuable for them to have a foothold in the region. And the Soviet involvement with Egypt would later prompt America to become much more active in Middle Eastern politics, following what's known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. So, for those of you who see America as having always played an active role in Middle Eastern politics, that's somewhat anachronistic. Arguably, America's involvement in Middle Eastern politics really became much more pronounced, I would say. Is it pronounced? The word prominent. Let's call it prominent. After the 1950s, and specifically in 1954. As you guys recall, the Suez Crisis was a military defeat for Nasser, but because he had the international community on his side, Egypt, France, and Britain were forced to back off, and he played it like this big triumph of his. Now, in terms of domestic policies, I would say Abdel Nasser followed a very traditional path of land reform, modernization, agriculture, but agricultural, I guess you could say, reforms as well. So he kind of wanted to shift the land ownership from the upper classes to the middle classes and to try more public administration, and also to increase the amount of land that the poorest fallahin had. So I would argue that he did manage some changes for the poorer classes, but unfortunately he really just ended up shifting the power base and who was controlling it. And like many socialist policies, it ended up being corrupt and poorly managed. So his land reform policies didn't really do much to change Egypt's political system, the economic situation, I guess. Besides that, of course, it didn't help that there wasn't really much public criticism going on, considering the fact that Abdel Nasser was very, very active in monitoring the press, outlawing any other political opposition, and of course making sure that any other opposition members were most likely rotting in jail cells. So this, of course, meant that Abdel Nasser was pretty much unchecked in most of his policies. So in terms of most of the major developments of Abdel Nasser, they took place in the 1956-1958 era, and this is where Abdel Nasser turns more towards Arab nationalism. So the idea was, of course, that his vision was to create a greater Arab state, and this kind of, I would say, culminates in the 1967 war. The 1967 war, as you guys may recall, was a humiliating military defeat for the Arabs. It could be argued that one of the main weaknesses was that Abdel Nasser's nepotism, his tendency to promote people that he was personally close with as opposed to promoting the best people for the job, definitely didn't help the fact that the Israelis were able to mount a surprise offensive and incapacitate most of the Arab armies, and just plain old-fashioned Arab ineptitude, I guess, definitely didn't help them. So, of course, Abdel Nasser does manage several very ambitious projects. He continues in the public eye because even after he resigned in 1967, Abdel Nasser enjoyed a really high degree of support. And there were mass protests. People wanted him back. In fact, when he did finally die, there was an outpouring of grief from the Arab world because Abdel Nasser is a very controversial figure. While I would say fair and academic sources definitely assess him as an authoritarian leader, not wishing to use the term dictator because it's too politically charged, Arabs see him more as a unifying force, as a prominent nationalist, as a man who promoted the dignity and independence of the Arab people. And while he may have done that to an extent by pushing out the British and by creating a more nationalistic Egyptian state, he also created a nationalistic Egyptian state with himself at the head, with no real ability for press freedom, with no real ability for political freedom or democracy, and with no real chance of growing any kind of, political class. because there was pretty much just the dictator at the top. So the idea was, of course, that Abdel Nasser would eventually die only 3 years after the 67 war. I mean, I guess if you kind of romanticize him a little bit, you could argue that his health definitely wasn't helped by the fact that he had spent so many years building up this anger and this hostility towards Israel, only to die in less than a week. But it could have been argued as well that the man just wasn't that healthy. The thing that you guys should focus on as IB students, of course, is what factors helped him. So as we mentioned, Egypt, deeply politically unstable, very little trust for the British, very little trust for the Wafd government, very little trust for the king. So Abdel Nasser was seen as the man people needed, head of a modern institution, an authoritative institution. Here's the thing, Egyptians weren't stupid. They knew that they were signing up for a tyrant. The idea that they promoted is the idea of the just tyrant. So a lot of people in Egypt saw the democratic and political process as being ineffective. Egypt's political leaders and prime ministers were victims of assassination. They had very little political support. Many of them were from upper classes. So realistically speaking, there wasn't much potential for these people to be able to reach the populace. And so the populace understood it. But unfortunately, many people would reason that the biggest problem was that they always underestimated Abdel Nasser. He was a clever, sneaky guy, and he was able to manipulate power, make alliances when it suited him, break them when he no longer needed someone. So of course, besides that, how did he manage to consolidate power? Slowly, gradually, methodically. Picking off his enemies, making it seem like people were being arrested on trumped up charges, having them tried for sedition, accusing them of this or that, but of course, never actually going out and just having these mass arrests and roundups until he knew that he was secure in his power. So, of course, besides that, his domestic policy is a broad, bland kind of Arab socialism with, I would argue, limited effect. See, nationalization works on some level, but the fact of the matter is it transfers power a lot of the time from corrupt private officials to corrupt public officials. A public system is no more efficient than a private system if it doesn't have any kind of accountability and if it falls victim to the traditional Arab, well, I'm not trying to be, ethnocentric or racist about it, but definitely if it falls victim to the kind of inefficiency and corruption which unfortunately have tended to plague Arab institutions for pretty much ever. So in any case, Abdel Nasser's story is of a man who saw an opportunity and took it, who took, I would say, a turbulent and deeply divided country and tried to make himself the head of it. And before anybody knew, he was a very authoritarian and very, I would say, undemocratic leader who managed to enact a lot of very big changes, but many people would argue wasn't really able to resolve a lot of the endemic poverty and inequality that faced Egypt. Some scholars would go as far as to argue that Egypt's current political instability is the result of the system that was enacted under Abdel Nasser, which placed a lot of power in the hands of the president and really gave very little, I would say, room for democratic maneuvering. But that's another topic for another day. In any case, thank you guys for watching, and I hope this has been helpful.